Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to another video, and this video is going to be the start of a new series I'll be doing called Underrated Bands. Now this series is going to be a list of bands, that I think are very underrated, whether they be in the punk scene, whether they be a metal band or whatever. They'll all be in this, all the underrated bands that I can think of and that I've found, that I listen to, that I recommend. So this video is going to be for a band that I think are very underrated, and the first one is going to be Forever Came Calling. Now this band started around 2006 actually as a cover band of Taking Back Sunday and Senses Fail, and after that, of course, they recorded a split EP with Handguns, which got a little bit of attention, but how they really got their attention actually was Warped Tour. That's actually how I found out who they were, and then I first heard their album Contender and thought it was absolutely great, perfect album. Of course, some people say it was too short. I think it was actually a perfect album. Every song on the album, is just, fits together perfectly in the album, especially, songs like The Office and Front Porch Sunrise, If Bukowski Could See Me Now. And these guys, of course, around during the time of bands like Neck Deep and Man Overboard when they first started to get in a little bit of fame, especially like Neck Deep. Man Overboard is another band that I'll talk about later, but Forever Came Calling was one of those bands that, it's kind of the emo pop punk kind of thing that was becoming a little bit of a bigger thing in the early 2010s, and it's kind of surprising that they actually didn't get more fame out of this whole thing, like bands like Neck Deep actually did, because, they're doing similar kind of music that they were, of course, and I think they mainly didn't get more fame because they didn't release enough music within that time to really, get that amount of fame, and didn't release, enough albums. The only album that they released around the early 2010s was Contender, and besides that they did a few split EPs, but that of course wasn't enough to get them to fame. They still got some fans from, doing Warped Tour and stuff like that, but, they of course didn't really get to too much fame. I still think they're a great band though. They're actually signed to Pure Noise Records, which is, a moderately famous, has a lot of moderately famous bands on that record label, and I think, has had some pretty good bands over the years. So check out Forever Came Calling. They're a great band and I definitely recommend them. And number 2 is Corrosion of Conformity. These guys started in like the 80s as like a hardcore kind of band, like a hardcore punk kind of band for the first couple albums. And then with their album Blind, they kind of went more towards like, the more slower kind of grudgy metal, like stoner metal kind of thing. And I thought it was really cool actually. The first album I heard from them was actually Blind, and then I heard their earlier albums like Animosity and a couple others I can't remember the name of, but they definitely did something great with this whole, stoner metal thing. I think they're the best out of, the whole genre actually, to be honest. And they got a little bit of fame, of course they're a moderately famous band. They weren't massively famous, but I think they definitely deserve more fame for what they did, And these guys are actually still releasing music to this day, if you can believe it, after so many years. Like around 20-30 years, they're still actually making music, And my favorite albums by them are by far like Blind and Deliverance. I think those were the two best albums by them, and that was the best era for Corrosion of Conformity. So check out Corrosion of Conformity if you're into like metal and kind of more slower kind of, stoner kind of metal. Check them out, and if you're into hardcore punk, I'd recommend their earlier stuff for sure, because their earlier stuff was actually pretty good too, And number 3 is Big Drill Car. Now these guys were around the late 80s, and they were actually on Cruise Records, which was a record label that was famous for bands like All and Down by Law, which were also signed to record labels like Epitaph later on. Of course, Big Drill Car didn't go on to be one of those bands, probably because they broke up after around, I think, 5 years or so. And they got back together, of course, after so long. They haven't really released any new music since, but they're back together, I think, currently doing tours, if I'm not mistaken. But for the first, their albums that they released, I think they're definitely very good, pretty much all of them, especially CD type thing. That's by far my favorite one. It has some of my favorite songs on it, like In Green Fields. And there's actually a video for that. If you want to check it out, I'll probably link it in the description here of this video. But yeah, these guys inspired many other great bands, like the Vandals, you know, Blink-182. They've definitely held inspiration in them, and they actually did open a lot for All, which is how they got a little bit of attention, of course. You know, they weren't totally unknown, but they were pretty unknown for sure, though. And if you ask most people, even like in the punk scene, they probably don't know who they are, you know, so I definitely recommend these guys. They're, you know, back together, of course. I don't know when they'll be touring again, but they're back together, so if you want to check them out, like, live or anything, check them out when COVID's all done, or if they're doing a you know, socially distanced tour or whatever, you know. So yeah, I definitely recommend Big Drill Car. And number 4 is Man Overboard. Now these guys were around the same time Forever Came Calling was around. They released, you know, kind of this more emo kind of pop punk kind of music, which I think was definitely a good thing at the time. I think one of the reasons why they didn't really get to fame was because, you know, they didn't have the right songs, you know, not necessarily they weren't a great band, but, you know, they didn't release the right songs to necessarily become famous, of course, and I think that's mainly why they didn't, you know, get much fame. They still, of course, got a little bit of fame, though. They were signed to a pretty known record label, of course, and, you know, they made some great music, and they're still making music, actually, I think, and I definitely recommend them. The first song I heard from them, I think it was Montrose. That's one of their older ones, and I actually heard it like years ago, I think not too soon after it first came out, and I was like, dang, this is kind of different, you know. I was used to hearing stuff like, you know, it was more like happy, like Blink-182, like more major kind of scales, but these guys are doing like more sad kind of stuff, and some of it was actually kind of good, you know, if I was in the right mood, of course. And yeah, I definitely recommend these guys if you're into like that kind of scene, of course, into that kind of music. So that is it for the first episode of Most Underrated Bands. Let me know if you guys have any underrated bands that you want to recommend to me. I'll check them out, you know, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.